The desert wind carried dust devils across Samuel Torres's land, like ghosts dancing in the fading light. His ranch sat alone in the vastness of New Mexico territory, miles from the nearest settlement of San Rafael. The adobe walls of his home absorbed the day's heat, and his barn, a modest structure of weathered wood, housed 3 horses and the last of his winter hay. Samuel stood at his fence line, watching the sun bleed orange across the Sandia Mountains, when he saw the figure stumbling toward his property. The man moved like a skeleton wrapped in rags, each step a battle against gravity. Samuel's hand instinctively moved to the rifle leaning against the fence post, but he didn't raise it. Years ago he would have. Years ago, when he wore the blue uniform and tracked Apache raiders through these same arroyos, he would have challenged any stranger approaching his land. But that man died somewhere between the treaties and the broken promises, between the violence he committed and the peace he now desperately sought. The stranger collapsed 20 yards from Samuel's gate. Without thinking, Samuel vaulted the fence and reached the man in seconds. Up close, he could see the sun-cracked lips, the hollow eyes, the ribs pressing against paper-thin skin. This wasn't a threat. This was a man being consumed by the desert itself. Samuel half-carried, half-dragged him to the house. Inside, he laid the stranger on a woven blanket and brought water, forcing himself to pour slowly despite the man's desperate gulping. In the corner, his own meager supplies stared back at him: 3 potatoes, dried beans, a small piece of salt pork. He'd planned to ride to San Rafael tomorrow for supplies, stretching what little money his last cattle sale had brought. But tomorrow was tomorrow. Tonight, this man needed food. He prepared everything he had, boiling the potatoes with the pork, soaking the beans until they softened. The stranger ate with trembling hands, tears cutting clean lines down his dusty face. He spoke only once in a voice like gravel scraping stone. "You don't know what you've done." Samuel assumed he meant gratitude. The words felt heavier than that, but exhaustion glazed the stranger's eyes, and within minutes he fell into unconscious sleep. Samuel covered him with a blanket and stepped outside. The night had settled completely now, stars scattered across the black canvas of sky like silver coins. The horses whinnied softly from the barn. Everything felt still. Too still. He shook off the unease and returned inside, lying down on his own bedroll across the room from the stranger, letting sleep claim him despite the gnawing emptiness in his own stomach. The scream of horses woke him near midnight. Samuel bolted upright, instinct flooding his limbs with adrenaline. Orange light flickered through his window. He ran outside and his heart stopped. The barn was engulfed in flames, fire climbing the dry wood like hungry fingers reaching for the sky. His horses shrieked inside, trapped. Samuel sprinted forward, but the heat drove him back. He circled desperately, finding a gap in the flames near the side door. Smoke choked his lungs as he burst inside, releasing the horses who thundered past him into the night. He grabbed what tack he could carry and stumbled out just as the roof collapsed inward with a roar that shook the ground. He stood there, soot-covered and gasping, watching years of work turn to ash and ember. When he finally turned back to the house, his blood ran cold. The door stood open. The blanket lay empty on the floor. The stranger was gone, vanished into the desert night as completely as if he'd never existed at all. And on the table, written in ash, were 2 words that made Samuel's past come crashing back: "Remember Socorro." Chapter 2. Shadows of Socorro. Samuel didn't sleep the rest of that night. He sat on his porch with his rifle across his knees, watching the barn's embers glow like dying stars against the darkness. His 3 horses had scattered into the desert, and he'd spent an hour rounding them up by moonlight, tying them to the fence posts since they had nowhere else to go. The message written in ash haunted him more than the fire itself. Socorro, a name he hadn't spoken aloud in 7 years. As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Samuel's mind drifted back to 1875. He'd been 23 then, working as a scout for the army at Fort Craig. His job was to track Apache movements, to serve as a bridge between 2 worlds. He belonged to neither. His mother had been Mexican, his father a trader who'd disappeared before Samuel could remember him. He spoke Spanish, English, and enough Apache to negotiate. That made him valuable. It also made him a traitor in the eyes of nearly everyone. Socorro had been a supply town, a dusty collection of buildings along the Rio. Grande, where merchants sold goods to the fort, and travelers rested before, crossing the Jornada del Muerto, the journey of the dead. Man, Samuel had been there with a patrol when word came of an Apache raid on a nearby ranch. The commanding officer, Lieutenant Morrison, was young and hungry for recognition. He pushed them hard, tracking the raiders to a small canyon where they'd made camp. Samuel remembered arguing against the attack. The camp held mostly women, children, and elders. The warriors had already moved on. But Morrison wanted prisoners, wanted to return to Socorro as a hero. What happened next still visited Samuel in nightmares. The shooting started before negotiations could even begin. Chaos erupted. Samuel tried to stop it, shouting in Apache for surrender. But gunfire drowned out everything. When the smoke cleared, 11 people lay dead. Among them was an old medicine man who'd been teaching a young boy, maybe 10 years old, how to weave a basket. The boy had survived, pulled from the carnage by his mother who took a bullet shielding him. Samuel had locked eyes with that child across the blood-soaked ground. The hatred in those young eyes burned hotter than any desert sun. Morrison had ordered the survivors marched to Socorro, where they'd be processed and sent to the reservation at Bosque Redondo. Samuel had refused to continue serving after that day. He'd turned in his scout contract, used his savings to buy this isolated piece of land, and tried to build something clean from the dirt and stone. But you can't outrun ghosts. Samuel stood now staring at the ruins of his barn and wondered if that boy from Socorro had grown into the skeletal stranger who'd appeared at his gate. The timing would be right. 17 years old now, maybe 18, old enough to track someone across the territory, old enough to want revenge. But why the elaborate setup? Why accept food and shelter only to burn down the barn? It didn't make tactical sense, and the Apaches Samuel had known were nothing if not tactical. He needed answers, and there was only one place to get them. San Rafael was 15 miles south, but Socorro itself was 40 miles beyond that. The trip would take 2 days of hard riding, and he'd need supplies he couldn't afford. Samuel walked to his house and pulled up a loose floorboard near his bed. Hidden beneath were 3 items: a small leather pouch containing $47 in coins, every cent he had left, his old Army Scout badge, and a folded letter he'd never mailed. He pocketed the money and held the badge for a long moment before tucking it into his shirt pocket. The letter was addressed to Maria Delgado in Socorro. He'd written it 5 years ago, trying to explain what happened that day, trying to apologize for failing to stop the massacre. He'd never sent it, because words felt obscene compared to what had been taken. But Maria had been there in Socorro, helping process the survivors. She'd been a teacher, trying to help Apache children adapt to reservation life. If anyone would remember that boy, it would be her. Samuel saddled his strongest horse, a gray mare named Luna, and loaded his saddlebags with what little remained: some jerky, a canteen, a bedroll. As he prepared to leave, something caught his eye near the barn's ashes. He walked over and found it half buried in the dirt, a small woven basket, partially burned but still recognizable. His blood turned to ice. It was the same pattern he'd seen that day in the canyon, the one the old medicine man had been teaching the boy to make. This wasn't random. This was a message. Someone wanted him to remember, wanted him to come looking. Samuel mounted Luna and pointed her south toward Socorro. The sun climbed higher, already baking the desert floor. Somewhere out there the stranger was waiting, and Samuel had a terrible feeling that the burning barn was just the beginning of a debt he'd never be able to repay. The question now wasn't whether he'd find the stranger, it was whether he'd survive what came after. The journey south tested every ounce of Samuel's endurance. Luna carried him steadily through terrain that shifted from rocky arroyos to flat desert plains, dotted with creosote bush and yucca. The sun was merciless, turning the air into a shimmering curtain of heat that distorted the horizon. Samuel rationed his water carefully, stopping only when Luna needed rest, his mind churning through possibilities with each mile that passed beneath them. By late afternoon of the first day, he reached San Rafael. The settlement had grown since his last visit. A new general store stood next to the old cantina, and a small church with a wooden cross marked the town's expanding ambitions. Samuel watered Luna at the public trough and considered his options. He needed information, but asking questions in a place like this meant starting conversations he wasn't sure he wanted to finish. Small towns had long memories, and his past as an army scout made some folks nervous. He tied Luna outside the general store and stepped into the dim interior. The shopkeeper, a heavy-set man named Harold Briggs, looked up from his ledger with the practiced smile of someone who measured friendliness by potential profit. Samuel bought hardtack, coffee, and ammunition for his rifle, paying with coins that felt heavier leaving his hand than they should have. As Briggs wrapped the supplies, Samuel took a chance. "You heard of any strangers passing through recently?" "Man traveling alone. Looked like he'd been walking through hell." Samuel kept his voice casual, examining a row of canned goods as if the question was an afterthought. Briggs paused, his eyes narrowing with the calculation of a man deciding what information was worth sharing. "Strangers come through all the time, mister. This close to the Camino Real, we see all types. What's your interest?" Samuel met his gaze directly. "He stopped at my place 2 nights ago. Things went missing after he left. It wasn't quite a lie, but it wasn't the truth either." Briggs seemed to accept it, nodding slowly. "There was a fellow, maybe 4 days back, thin as a rail, wouldn't speak to nobody. Bought a canteen and some dried beef. Paid with Mexican coins, old ones. He headed south towards Socorro, I remember, because he asked about the road 4 days ago. That meant the stranger had been planning this, had passed through San Rafael before doubling back to Samuel's ranch. The calculation in that sent a chill down Samuel's spine despite the heat. This wasn't impulse or opportunity. This was strategy. Samuel thanked Briggs, gathered his supplies, and left before more questions could come. He made camp that night in the shelter of a rock formation, building a small fire and brewing coffee that tasted like liquid bitterness, but shocked his tired system awake. The stars emerged one by one, the same stars that had witnessed everything that happened in Socorro 7 years ago. Samuel pulled out the unmailed letter to Maria Delgado and read it by firelight. His own words from 5 years ago staring back at him like accusations. "Dear Miss Delgado, I don't expect forgiveness and I don't deserve your time. But I need you to know that what happened in that canyon wasn't warfare. It was murder. I tried to stop it, I failed. That failure has carved itself into everything I am. The faces of those who died follow me like shadows. If there's anything I can do, any way to make even the smallest amends, I would give everything I have. But I know some debts can't be repaid. Some wounds don't heal. I'm sorry doesn't mean anything measured against what was taken, but it's all I have. Samuel Torres." He folded the letter and tucked it away. Tomorrow he'd reach Socorro, and maybe Maria could help him understand who that boy had become and why he'd chosen this particular form of revenge. Samuel extinguished the fire and lay back, watching the Milky Way stretch across the infinite black. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of burning buildings and baskets woven from memory and rage. The second day brought him into familiar territory that felt like returning to a grave he'd tried to forget. The landscape changed as he approached the Rio Grande Valley. Cottonwood trees appeared, their leaves rustling in the breeze like whispered warnings. Irrigation ditches carved geometric patterns through fields, where farmers coaxed crops from the desert. Socorro itself emerged in the distance, larger than Samuel remembered, its church steeple reaching toward heaven, as if asking questions the town couldn't answer. Samuel entered from the North Road, drawing curious glances from people who might or might not remember his face. 7 years was long enough for some memories to fade, but not all. He guided Luna toward the center of town, looking for anything that might point him toward Maria Delgado. The old schoolhouse still stood near the church, its adobe walls the same dusty tan they'd always been. A woman was sweeping the front steps, her dark hair streaked with gray, her movements carrying the efficiency of someone who'd repeated the same task 10,000 times. Samuel dismounted and approached slowly, removing his hat in a gesture of respect. When the woman looked up, recognition flickered in her eyes, not immediate, but dawning like sunrise over the mountains. "Maria Delgado?" His voice came out rougher than he intended. She stopped sweeping, her knuckles whitening around the broom handle. "Samuel Torres. I wondered if you'd ever come back." Her tone wasn't hostile, but it wasn't warm either. It was the voice of someone who'd learned to live with ghosts. "I need your help, Miss Delgado. There was a boy 7 years ago from the canyon. He would be 17 or 18 now. His mother died protecting him during the—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Maria did it for him. "During the massacre. She set the broom against the wall and studied his face with eyes that had witnessed too much suffering to be surprised by more. "You're talking about Joseph. Joseph Chi. And if he's found you, Mr. Torres, then you need to understand something important. That boy didn't just lose his mother that day. He lost his entire world. And he's been looking for the man who led the soldiers to his family for 7 long years." Maria Delgado led Samuel into the schoolhouse, away from the curious eyes of Socorro's main street. The interior smelled of chalk dust and old paper, sunlight streaming through windows that illuminated rows of empty desks. She gestured for him to sit, but remained standing herself, arms crossed as if holding together something that might otherwise fall apart. "Joseph came to me 3 years ago," she began, her voice measured and careful. "He'd escaped from Bosque Redondo. Not the first to do it, won't be the last. That reservation is a slow death for the Apache people. He was sick, starving, and carrying so much anger I thought it would consume him before the desert did." She paused, looking out the window toward the distant mountains. "I gave him food, taught him to read and write English. I thought maybe education could redirect that anger into something constructive. I was wrong." Samuel felt his throat tighten. "What did you tell him about me?" Maria turned back to face him, her expression unreadable. "I told him the truth. That you tried to stop it. That you were the only one who spoke against Lieutenant Morrison. That you left the army because of what happened." She moved closer, her voice dropping. "But truth doesn't heal wounds like his, Mr. Torres. His mother's last words to him were to survive and remember. That's exactly what he's done. Why burn my barn? Why not just confront me directly?" Samuel's hands clenched into fists on his knees, frustration mixing with guilt in equal measure. "If he wants revenge, I won't stop him. I've carried this for 7 years. Maybe it's time to—" Maria cut him off sharply. "He doesn't want your death, Samuel. He wants you to understand loss. He wants you to feel what he felt. Helpless, watching something precious burn while you can do nothing to stop it." The words landed like physical blows. Samuel stood abruptly, pacing the small room. "So what happens now? He destroys everything I have, piece by piece. I have nothing left except that land and those horses. The barn was—" He stopped, realization dawning cold and terrible. "He's not finished, is he?" Maria shook her head slowly. 3 days ago, Joseph came here. He told me he'd found you, that he'd studied your routine for weeks. He knew you'd share your last meal with a stranger. He counted on your guilt making you generous. He said burning the barn was just the beginning, that he'd take from you what Morrison took from his people. But Samuel, I don't think he fully understands what he's doing. That boy is being eaten alive by grief disguised as purpose. Where is he now?" Samuel moved toward the door, but Maria stepped into his path. "Wait. There's something else you need to know." She reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a worn leather journal, pressing it into Samuel's hands. "Joseph left this with me before he went to your ranch. He said if anything happened to him, I should give it to you. He's sick, Samuel. Really sick. Some kind of fever he picked up at the reservation. He's been fighting it for months, but it's winning." Samuel opened the journal with trembling hands. The pages were filled with drawings, landscapes, animals, and faces. So many faces. His mother, the old medicine man, children playing, warriors on horseback. The artistic skill was extraordinary, each image rendered with careful detail and obvious love. Toward the end, the drawings became darker. Soldiers attacking, buildings burning, people fleeing. And on the final page, a single sentence written in careful English. "I want to hate him, but hatred is just another prison." "He's at the old Garcia Ranch," Maria said quietly. 5 miles east of here. The family abandoned it 2 years ago. Roof partially collapsed, well gone dry. Joseph's been camping there, planning his next move. But I don't think he has many moves left in him, Samuel. That fever is burning him up from the inside. She placed a hand on his arm. "You can't give him his mother back. You can't undo what Morrison did. But maybe you can give him something else." Samuel didn't ask what that something was. He already knew. He thanked Maria, tucked the journal carefully into his saddlebag, and rode east as the afternoon sun began its descent toward evening. The Garcia Ranch appeared like a broken promise against the horizon, adobe walls crumbling, wooden beams exposed where the roof had fallen in. Tumbleweeds gathered against the walls like mourners at a funeral. He found Joseph in what had once been the main house. lying on a bedroll in a corner where the roof still provided shade. The young man looked even worse than he had at Samuel's ranch. The fever had painted his face with flushed red patches, and his breathing came in shallow, labored gasps. Our canteen lay empty beside him, and Samuel could see the supplies were nearly gone. Samuel knelt beside him, and Joseph's eyes fluttered open. Recognition sparked there, followed by something complex. Anger, yes, but also exhaustion, and something that might have been relief. "You came," Joseph whispered, his voice barely audible. "I wasn't sure you would." Samuel pulled out his own canteen and helped Joseph drink, supporting his head with surprising gentleness. "Your barn—" Joseph started, but Samuel shook his head. "I know why you did it," Maria told me. "And she's right. You made me understand loss." Samuel set the canteen down and met Joseph's fevered gaze directly. "But I need you to understand something too. What happened to your family was wrong. Morrison was wrong. I was wrong for not stopping it, for not doing more. I have spent 7 years trying to build something good from that failure, but it doesn't balance the scales. Nothing can." Joseph closed his eyes, tears leaking from the corners. "My mother said you were different from the others. Even while she was dying, she said you tried to help. I didn't want to believe her. Hating you was easier than accepting that maybe the world isn't divided into simple categories of good and evil." He coughed, the sound wet and painful. "I wanted to destroy you, but watching you share your last food with me, a stranger who might have been your enemy, I realized something. You're already destroyed. You're just better at hiding it." Samuel felt something break inside his chest, years of carefully maintained walls crumbling like the ranch around them. "I can't give you back what was taken, but I can give you something else. Come back with me. Let me take care of you until this fever breaks. You can have my land, my horses, whatever you need to start over. And when you're strong enough, if you still want to burn it all down, I won't stop you. But don't die here alone in this broken place. Your mother didn't sacrifice herself, so you could waste away seeking revenge that won't heal anything." Joseph opened his eyes again, studying Samuel's face with an intensity that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "Why would you do this?" "After everything," Samuel smiled sadly, "because that basket you left in my barn's ashes. I recognize the pattern. It's the same one your grandfather was teaching you the day he died. You finished it. You kept learning even after everything was taken from you. That kind of strength deserves a chance to build something instead of just burning it down." The silence stretched between them, filled only with the sound of wind whistling through the broken walls. Finally, Joseph nodded, the gesture small but unmistakable. Samuel carefully lifted him, surprised by how light he'd become, and carried him outside where Luna waited patiently. The journey back to his ranch would take hours, and Joseph might not survive it. But Samuel had spent 7 years running from his past. It was time to finally face it, not with violence or revenge, but with the only thing he had left to offer, a chance at redemption for them both. As they rode north through the gathering dusk, Samuel thought about Maria's words. Some debts couldn't be repaid, some wounds wouldn't heal, but maybe, just maybe, 2 broken people could build something new from the ashes of what they'd lost. The desert stretched endlessly around them, indifferent to human pain and human hope alike. But somewhere in that vastness, Samuel chose to believe there was room for both of them to find peace. 3 months later, Joseph stood beside Samuel at the site where the barn had burned. Together they'd cleared the ashes and begun laying foundation stones for something new, not just a barn, but a workshop where Joseph could practice the traditional crafts his grandfather had begun teaching him years ago. The fever had broken after 2 weeks of careful nursing, and slowly Joseph's strength had returned. They didn't talk much about the past. Instead, they focused on the daily work of survival, repairing fences, tending horses, preparing for winter. One evening, as they sat watching the sun set over the Sandia Mountains, Joseph spoke quietly. "I thought destroying you would give me peace. But this, building something together, this feels more like what my mother would have wanted." Samuel nodded, watching the sky turn from gold to purple. "Your grandfather's basket is in my house. I kept it. Maybe someday you can teach me the pattern." Joseph smiled, the first genuine smile Samuel had seen from him. "Maybe someday." And in that fragile possibility of shared futures rather than divided pasts, Samuel finally felt the weight he'd carried for 7 years begin to lighten. The desert wind blew across their land, carrying with it the promise of change. Not forgetting, never forgetting, but perhaps finally forgiving. Winter arrived early that year, sweeping down from the mountains with winds that cut through clothing like knives made of ice. Samuel and Joseph worked through the cold months, their breath forming clouds in the morning air as they continued building the workshop. The structure took shape slowly. Adobe walls rising from the foundation, wooden beams salvaged from the old barn supporting a new roof. Joseph's craftsmanship surprised Samuel. The young man's hands, which had once woven baskets and drawn intricate pictures, now shaped wood and stone with the same careful precision. But peace, Samuel was learning, was a fragile thing in New Mexico territory. 3 weeks before Christmas, a rider appeared on the horizon. Samuel saw him first, stopping mid-swing with an axe in his hands as he watched the figure approach. Joseph emerged from the workshop, wiping clay from his hands, his eyes narrowing against the winter sun. The rider was a Mexican man in his 50s, wearing the dusty clothes of someone who'd traveled far. He dismounted slowly, respectfully, and removed his hat. "Señor Torres, my name is Miguel Fuentes. I own a ranch 20 miles west of here, near the old mission." His Spanish carried the formal tone of someone delivering important news. Samuel set down the axe and approached, extending his hand in greeting. "What brings you all this way, Señor Fuentes?" Miguel glanced at Joseph, then back to Samuel, choosing his words carefully. "There is trouble coming. I thought you should know given your history." Samuel felt his stomach tighten. "What kind of trouble?" Miguel shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. "Lieutenant Morrison. He's returned to New Mexico. He's been reassigned to Fort Craig with a promotion, captain now. And, Señor Torres, he's been asking questions about you, about what happened 7 years ago." The name hit Samuel like a physical blow. He hadn't heard Morrison's name spoken aloud since the day he'd turned in his scout badge and walked away from the army. Joseph stepped forward, his body tense. "What kind of questions?" Miguel looked at the young man with sympathy. "Questions about Army scouts who left service. Questions about Apache raids and old grievances. Captain Morrison is building a case, they say. Some officers back east are investigating what happened in certain campaigns. Too many complaints from missionaries and teachers about excessive force. Morrison knows people remember Socorro. He's trying to find someone to blame besides himself." Samuel's mind raced through the implications. Morrison had always been ambitious, always calculating. If there was an investigation, the lieutenant, now captain, would need a scapegoat. And Samuel, the scout who'd quit in protest, who'd spoken against the attack, who'd disappeared into the desert rather than continue serving, would be the perfect target. "How long do I have?" Samuel asked quietly. 2 weeks, maybe 3. There's a formal inquiry scheduled at Fort Craig in January. Morrison has already sent men to San Rafael asking about you. It's only a matter of time before they come here. Miguel placed his hat back on his head. "I owed your mother a debt, Señor Torres. She helped my family during the cholera outbreak 15 years ago. This is how I repay it, with a warning. What you do with it is your choice." After Miguel left, Samuel and Joseph stood in silence, watching the rider disappear into the distance. Joseph spoke first, his voice steady but laced with anger. "He'll blame you for everything. Make you the villain so he can be the hero." Samuel nodded slowly. "That's exactly what he'll do. And I don't have proof of anything. It's his word against mine, and he's a decorated officer while I'm just a former scout living in the middle of nowhere." "Not just you," Joseph said firmly. "He'll come after me too if he knows I'm here. An Apache survivor of Socorro, living with the scout who supposedly led the attack. That's too convenient for his story to ignore." The young man's jaw clenched. "I won't let him use us like that. I won't let him twist what really happened into something that protects him and destroys you." Samuel turned to face Joseph fully. "You could leave. Head south into Mexico or west to California. Start fresh where nobody knows your face or your story. You don't owe me anything, Joseph. Staying here puts you at risk." Joseph's eyes flashed with determination. "My mother told me to survive and remember. I've done both. But she also taught me that survival without purpose is just waiting to die. You gave me a chance when you didn't have to. You could have turned me away that night, but you shared your last meal. That means something. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity and planning. Samuel rode to San Rafael and spoke quietly with Harold Briggs at the general store, asking about lawyers or officials who might listen to his side of the story. The news wasn't encouraging. Most civilian authorities deferred to military justice in matters involving army personnel. Maria Delgado made the journey north to Samuel's ranch, bringing with her documents she'd kept from 7 years ago. Testimonies from Apache survivors, notes from her own observations, even a letter she'd written to the territorial governor that had been ignored. This might not be enough, Maria admitted, spreading the papers across Samuel's kitchen table. But it's something. It proves there were witnesses who contradicted Morrison's official report. She looked at both men seriously. There's another option. You could both testify at the inquiry. Tell the truth about what happened. It's risky. Morrison has power and connections, but silence guarantees he controls the narrative. Joseph leaned forward, studying the documents. What happens if we testify and they don't believe us? Maria met his gaze without flinching. Then Morrison wins and the truth gets buried. But if you don't testify, the outcome is the same. At least this way the truth gets spoken aloud. Someone will hear it, even if they choose not to act on it. Samuel felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. For 7 years he'd hidden from his past, tried to build something clean and separate from the violence of Socorro. But the past had found him anyway, first through Joseph's justified anger, and now through Morrison's calculated self-preservation. Running would solve nothing. It would only confirm whatever lies Morrison chose to tell. We testify, Samuel said finally. Both of us. We tell exactly what happened, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And whatever comes from that, we face it together. He looked at Joseph. But you need to understand what this means. Morrison will paint you as a hostile, me as a traitor. They might not believe us. They might decide we're both guilty of something. Joseph stood, his posture straight and resolute. 7 years ago I was a child who watched his world burn. I couldn't speak for myself or for the people who died. Now I can. My mother didn't sacrifice herself so I could hide in the desert and let lies become history. If we're going to face Morrison, then let's face him with the truth. His hand moved to his chest, where beneath his shirt hung a small medicine bag containing earth from his mother's grave. She'll be with us. And maybe that's enough. The night before they were scheduled to leave for Fort Craig, Samuel and Joseph sat by a fire outside the workshop. The structure was nearly complete now, wall solid, roof secure, windows installed. Inside, Joseph had already begun creating his first pieces, baskets woven in traditional patterns, small wooden carvings, a loom for weaving blankets. It represented everything they'd built together, everything they stood to lose, whatever happens, Samuel said, watching sparks rise toward the star-filled sky. I want you to know that these past months have meant something. You gave me a chance to be more than my worst mistake. That's a gift I never expected and don't deserve, but I'm grateful for it. Joseph poked at the fire with a stick, sending up a fresh shower of sparks. You keep saying you don't deserve things. Maybe it's time to stop punishing yourself and start believing that people can be more than their worst moments. Samuel smiled sadly. That's wisdom beyond your years, Joseph shrugged. My grandfather used to say that pain either makes you bitter or makes you wise. The choice is yours. He looked up at Samuel. Tomorrow, when we face Morrison, we won't just be defending ourselves. We'll be defending everyone who can't speak for themselves, all the people whose stories get erased by official reports and convenient lies. As the fire burned low and the desert night grew colder, both men understood that the morning would bring a reckoning. Morrison would have his story, carefully crafted and politically advantageous. But Samuel and Joseph had something more powerful. The truth, messy and complicated and painful as it was. Whether that would be enough to overcome corruption and self-interest remained to be seen. But they would face it standing together, two unlikely allies bound by shared loss and shared hope for something better. The desert wind whispered through the darkness, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow's challenges and the faint hope that sometimes, against all odds, truth could still matter.